Let's take you live now to the Sandton Convention Centre, where my colleague, senior reporter Aviwe Mtila, is outside the Convention Centre. Aviwe, just under 2 hours left before President Cyril Ramaphosa officially opened the BRICS summit this year. What's happening outside? I'm sure it's a hive of activity with many important people arriving.
Good afternoon, Maseko, and I'm outside the Sandton Convention Centre, where, of course, very heavily guarded. It's been heavily guarded for the last number of days. From the early morning, there's a heavy police contingency on the ground. Time and again, you'll hear those sirens going off, as is the case this very moment, with this police actually about to drive in. Yeah, not sure which dignitary is actually inside the vehicles that you see right now, but we can assure you that they are diplomatic delegates heading into the convention center itself. You heard we're expecting at least 50 heads of state to be part of this year's BRICS summit. It's the 15th summit itself, the third held on South African soil. And of course, we know that a number of presidents have already arrived in the country, including the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. You can see the police themselves cordoning off just the area where the convention center is itself. Even the two streets here, one is still used for the public consumption, where the public can still use one of the lanes here, but the other lane has been reserved for the delegates of the convention center. What we've seen, though, through the majority of the day is that some 3 kilometers away from where we are, there have been small groups that have been protesting, especially some of the around the delegates that will be here. We heard protesters from Ethiopia protesting the arrival of the Ethiopian Prime Minister here, saying that there are a lot of atrocities that they have suffered at the hands of the Ethiopian Prime Minister. Not only them, we also saw a protest from a Pakistani delegation suggesting that their own president there has a lot to answer to, and that this BRICS summit must talk to that. But of course, we had the Helen Suzan Foundation, we had the Amnesty International South Africa, as well as the Ukrainian Association of South Africa, all out in placards there, just some 3 kilometers away from where we are, where they were protesting just the presence of Russia here, hoping that the BRICS delegates and the counterparts that are here will give their influence in order just to end that 18-month-long conflict that has been at Ukraine. In fact, I want you to take a listen to some of those sentiments that we heard on the ground, about 3 kilometers away from where we are here at the Sandton Convention Center.
We are calling for leaders of all BRICS countries and the guests to pressurize or use influence and demand from Russian authorities, demand from Putin to immediately stop Russian aggression and stop any military operation which happening in Ukraine right now. Withdraw all forces to return back to grain deal, to stop bombing our elevators and our grain storages, because it's simply being destroyed now. We cannot give it to anywhere. We cannot give it to rest of the world, and it simply gets bombed and burned. We also call to immediately remove all children which were illegally displaced from Ukraine.
Obviously, a very strategic time to start with this particular protest, Aviwe, but the summit is sitting for 3 days. What are the protesters telling you? Are they planning to intensify it during the course of the summit?
What we've seen, Maseko, is that there's a park as you make your way inside Sandton that's been reserved for those protests. What we were expecting is that those protests actually would be right in front of the Sandton Convention Center, as those different associations and those different groupings had applied to have those protests right in front of the convention center. Of course, with the purpose of those at least 50 plus state heads of state to be at least at a listening ear and to hear them out. But what has happened is that they've been told that they can't be around the vicinity or the precinct itself of the convention center, and what's been reserved for them is that they be at least, I think it's 3.7 kilometers away from where we are at the Innisfree Park when you make your way inside Sandton. Of course, there it's also heavily guarded by police, whether it be from the Johannesburg Metro Police or the South African Police Service itself. But what you'll also see, Maseko, is that each and every street around Sandton actually has some sort of police presence, whether it's just being those police there visible with those blue lights that are flickering, or it's the policemen on foot themselves walking around. But there's a heavy police presence here. What you'll also see is the drains that will give you an indication that all the drains and, you know, the underground tunnels of Sandton itself have actually been swept days ahead extensively. The colors that you see on the various drains around Sandton is an indication of the sweeping that has been happening. That will give you an indication just how the stringent the security measures are, as of course we expect these heavy heads of state. If you talk about the BRICS bloc itself, you'd understand just the population that they have when it comes to the world, the world counterparts themselves. It's 42% population just of the 5 BRIC blocks. That's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They make up 42% of the world population. If you are to look at the land area itself, they make up at least 23% of the world's land area. And when you talk of the GDP produce that they make and they give into the world, they take up a big chunk of some 32% of the GDP itself, which is actually larger than the 30% of the G7 countries.
Yes.
But they maintain, even in the gala dinner that I was in last night, that this is not even about that comparison or them trying, to be a threat to any country. They're not about that, but all they are about is just those communications and growing their economic ties. So we are expecting those protests to continue, and we'll be monitoring them, Maseko, as the conference and the summit itself goes on here.
And as Professor Stremlau said, Aviwe, a little earlier on, I was speaking to him, South Africa only contributes 1 or 2% of that 31.5% of the BRICS bloc's GDP. So it's quite little that we contribute there, but it makes sense that we are hosting this at the richest square mile in Africa, that is in Sandton City, to be able to show off somehow what we can do, at least in the African context, because as South Africa, that is mostly what we are fighting for Africa to be included as a whole in the BRICS bloc. Aviwe Mtila, our senior reporter out there in Sandton.